Happy Thursday, everyone. Please tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your frenemies, tell whoever that we are talking about our right to vote. And I see our guest is already in here. I just want to give you a little introduction first. I mean, if you're checking in, you know me, I'm Monique Pressley. This is our fourth, can you believe it? It's our fourth day of my new daily digital, Make It Make Sense. We are here live at noon on IG, and then after the show is done, and we promise to try to get you in like around noon and get you out at 12:30 in case you're watching at lunch while you're supposed to be working. And then it'll be posted on all my platforms. So far, it's in my feed on IG. By the weekend, it'll be on YouTube. It is also now, the past shows are on my Facebook page, facebook.com/I am Monique Pressley. So if you missed it, we spoke to attorney Benjamin Crump and discussed criminal justice and police misconduct on day one. Then on day two, we discussed Supreme Court justice nominations, the fact that there's about to be the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, and I had a special guest, Ms. Reese Colbert, Black Women Views. We talked about things you can do, action items about that. Then yesterday, critically important conversation from Dr. Benjamin. Dr. Georges Benjamin about COVID-19, where we stand right now, protocols, action items, and just public health and things we can do for our community in general. And now today, we are going to talk about voting. I know I've been telling you every day, Thursday, we're going to talk about voting, and we are here. For those of you who don't know, our right to vote. And when I say our right to vote, I don't just mean Black folks. I mean, folks, because if you attack the right to vote for anyone, you are attacking the right to vote for everyone, and you are attacking the stability and the legitimacy of democracy in the United States. So we have seen in the past few weeks, really the past month, attempts by the White House and by the legislature in order to get legislation passed. There were two key pieces of legislation that they were trying to get passed in the hopes of securing and stabilizing the right to vote and undoing some of the damage that has been being systematically done by the Supreme Court to gut the Voting Rights Act and to take out the protections that keep state by state from doing things that infringe upon and oppress our vote. But there is somebody who's in here now who knows much more about our voting rights and about what activism is looking like on the ground, about all of the things that we need to know about the vote, which is why even my little introductory part is short today, because I want to get to my guest, who I believe will be here. So it's my pleasure to welcome the Executive Director of Black Vote Matter Fund, Mr. Cliff Albright. Welcome, Cliff.
Hey, Monique, how you doing?
I'm doing really great. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right, although I will say I had 2 teeth removed 2 days ago. But I'm doing good. I can't complain. If that were the least of my troubles, then we'd be all right. But we got this bigger issue that you were just talking about in terms of our voting rights. So glad to be here, and congrats on the show and everything else that you got going on.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for coming under pain, because I've been doing a lot with these teeth, and right now I hope my dentist isn't watching, because I don't have my Invisalign in while I do my lives, and he's probably looking at me like, that's gonna count against her 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you for joining anyway. So my disclaimer that I'm going to put at the top of this segment is I am not in the least bit impartial when it comes to Black Voters Matter Fund, and when it comes to Mr. Cliff Albright, and when it comes to Miss Latasha Brown, them is my peoples. That's my folks. I ride. We actually worked together year before last. I can't believe it's been that long. In the fall of 2020 for the election in Texas, which is my home state, and I support fully the work that is being done by Black Voters Matter Fund. And let me just explain to you all before I get into it with Cliff, support fully does not mean that everything they say I agree with. Support fully does not mean that every measure that they take on behalf of their organization is the same measure that I would take if it was my organization, and I ain't got no voters' rights organization. So usually when they're doing things, I think twice, three times about why on the ground, which he's gonna tell you, they in practically every state, especially Southern Belt, they're taking the actions they're taking. So I just want, before I even ask these questions, for people to understand, we all have lanes and roles. And agitation is part of their responsibility for their organization. Okay, now that I got all that out of my chest, I don't have to ask those questions. Cliff,
What's
what part of
up?
the world? What part of the world are you in now?
Well, I'm actually home. I'm in Atlanta. It's been a crazy year. We've been back and forth to DC and all the other states where we're doing our work. Our bus is actually on the ground right now in Louisiana,
Okay.
doing a whole bus tour around redistricting going on in Louisiana. I know we'll get into that in a second, talk about this
Yeah.
latest Supreme Court decision and how that impacts redistricting and maps and all that. But yeah, so we're all over. Like you said, we got about 25 states where we do our work. 11 of those where we actually have staff, the 12, 13, 14 where we don't have staff, but we've got partners, we've got anchor groups, we've got community-based groups, we've got a whole network that we work with in some of those states. So yeah, it's been busy, but right now I'm at home in Atlanta and just glad to be here talking to you.
Okay, and tell us, what is the core mission of Black Voters Matter Fund?
Our core mission is to build power in Black communities, and we believe that voting is one way of doing that, but we also believe that it's not the only way of doing that. And that really informs and directs the way that we go about doing our work, right? We go about our work in a way where we're not just talking about elections, we're not just talking about one election cycle, we're not just talking about one candidate. In fact, on the back of our shirts, on the back of our hoodies, we've got a very clear message that says it's about us, it's about our community, it's about our issues, and we work on those issues with our partners 365 days out of the year around all of the issues that we're concerned about. That includes police brutality, police violence, right? It includes housing and gentrification. It includes economic justice. It includes health issues, whether that's Medicaid expansion or COVID. It includes, our education of our children and these attacks against so-called critical race theory. It includes
Yeah.
education at HBCUs, where we've got a whole HBCU campaign that we call Take the Field, where we support HBCU students as they're organizing, whether that's around voting or whether that's around housing issues on campus. And so we support local groups on a range of issues, because at the end of the day, that's what makes voting so powerful, right? That's
Yeah.
why it's so important, not because of just the exercise of voting and the tradition of going to the polling place. It's because through voting, we're able to get progress on all the other issues that affect our daily lives. That's why there's that connection. And so we organize around those issues. We support local groups. We give groups funding. We gave out $10 million in funding last year to community-based groups that do this work every day, that are credible messengers in their communities. And we partner around strategy and tools and technology and all that. But at the end of the day, it's about what are we doing together, unified, to demonstrate that we matter, our issues matter, our communities matter, and we matter not just because of our votes. We're not about just rounding up the Negroes to go cast some votes. We're about pulling together our power to impact
Yes.
our daily lives.
Yes, absolutely. And the vote is one of the ways that we are supposed to be able to exercise, attain, and obtain power. I want to say to those who are joining us as we're with Cliff Albright, I want to just draw your attention. In my feed a couple of weeks ago, I think I just posted it last week, but a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with Sean Morales Doyle from the Brennan Center, and they do so much work around data and data collection for voting rights, and the fact that voting rights are under attack, and what we're seeing by way of legislation and changes in the states, as well as explanations for what needs to be done across the United States and federally. So if you would go to the Brennan Center, first look at my interview, because it's going to be way more detailed than what we have time for with Cliff and I for the history of voting rights. You can find some of that there in my interview, and you can also find it on the Brennan Center's site. But I do at least want to, so we can do it by way of explanation, because when I go on, Cliff, and I say our voting rights are under attack, they're trying to take our right to vote, our voting rights are not secure, it never fails that I will have some people to come into the feed, and not just uber conservative people, people who consider themselves liberals, consider themselves progressive. Your right to vote isn't under attack. Nobody is keeping you from voting. Nobody is locking you out of the polls. And I have to dig way deep and go back and explain that it was necessary to have something passed in 1965, which by the skin of our teeth it happened, the Voting Rights Act. And that part of what it secured for us was an ability to, before a state even changes the way that they have voting regulations and guidelines, it has to be approved. There's a pre-clearance part of that legislation. And that measure was keeping, especially in the southern states, keeping us from having the things happen that we saw in Jim Crow, right? Where people were having one precinct for miles and miles and miles and had to walk to get to it, where people were having to count jelly beans and count marbles, where people would enclose and circle in horses around like armed military looking people on horses, keeping people from getting to the poll if they were Black, and then making way when they were white. It would keep things from happening that we now unfortunately are seeing again, where you didn't get your absentee ballots on time. If you got your absentee ballot, you would get it right before it was supposed to be turned in. All kinds of illegal measures in terms of the way that the votes were counted, when the votes were being counted, just all kinds of things that you could name that were happening predominantly in places populated by the poor and by people of color. And by people of color, I mean brown folks, yes, but more so disproportionately Black folks. So Cliff, when we watch these things getting gutted, you know, we see the Republicans circling their wagons and planning and plotting for the Supreme Court, and then using the rules of the Senate. And then we get to Shelby v. Holder, and now we don't have no pre-clearance no more.
Right.
We don't have none. They send it back to the Senate and say, we're not saying you can't do it, but you're going to have to make a new law to get it done. What have we been seeing happening across the United States since Shelby v. Holder?
Yeah, you explained a lot of it, you know, ever since Shelby v. Holder, which of course was in 2013. And importantly, part of the rationale that the court used at the time was, oh, well, y'all are doing so well in elections. In fact, we got a Black president now. There must not be any more voter suppression, right? And so they got rid of the pre-clearance. And what we've seen since then was all the things that you just talked about. We saw a wave of photo ID laws. We saw a wave of poll closures, thousands of polling places being closed in some states. We're seeing, you know, the attacks on vote by mail. We're seeing, you know, all kinds of other attacks. And then last year, what we saw was with the Brnovich decision, not only did they weaken Section 5, which is pre-clearance, but then they weakened Section 2, which allows for other forms of enforcement. And that also deals with what we just saw coming out of the Supreme Court this week in terms of the maps in Alabama. Section 2 is part of how they enforce unfair maps that take away Black voting rights. And so in Alabama, where we represent 27% of the population, right? That's more than 1 in 4. What we see is that we've only got 1 seat out of 7 where we actually have a chance of having a Black representative, right? And so we literally have half the representation of what we ought to have in a state like Alabama. And so they proposed maps that would have given 2 seats. We are only getting 1 seat, and the Supreme Court just basically gave them a green light to do so. In fact, what they're doing is they're giving a green light under this notion that there is no guarantee that you get any representation, right? That all the Voting Rights Act deals with is just that you got the right to vote, that you got the right to cast a ballot, but it doesn't really impact whether or not you got maps that lets you have a representative of your choice, whether that's a congressional map, a state legislative map, a county commission map, right? You see the point. You see where this is going. That basically, as long as you get to fill out the registration form and you get to vote, you don't necessarily get to have a say on how much power you actually have. That's the difference between voting rights and voting power. You've got a court that is trying to define our voting rights just in the sense of, can you fill out the form and can they walk in the courthouse? Are they still blocking you the way they used to do in the Selma courthouse that we see in Eyes on the Prize and everything? Or are you able to go vote? As long as you're able to go vote, then your power and your representation is not a protected right. That is throwing us back all the way to post-Reconstruction, because you mentioned the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Let us not forget that there was already a 15th Amendment in 1870.
Yep.
So some people think that we just been fighting for this right ever since 65. We had a whole amendment, amendment that said the right to vote shall not be infringed on the basis of race, which was created specifically because of the Civil War and because of Black folks needing the right to vote. And yet we still need to come back with Voting Rights Act in 1965. And now here we are today with that act being almost completely whittled away by a conservative Supreme Court that is very reminiscent to the types of courts we had post-Reconstruction, which is how we got to Jim Crow to begin with. So yes, when you raise that issue, Monique, about our voting rights being under attack, that's not hyperbole. That's not exaggeration. The same things that happened then are happening all over again. History does not just move in one line, in one direction. There are ebbs and flows, and you can go backwards. And we are in a period now where our voting rights are literally being taken backwards.
So explain to me, because we're looking at different ways that the vote is being infringed upon and under attack. And I think sometimes people don't even know that it's happening to them. Mm-hmm. So one of these that you mentioned is voter identification laws. Mm-hmm. And to my knowledge, this affects college students a lot, because depending on, they won't accept college ID, but they'll accept whatever. This can affect elderly, especially those who have a hard time getting to wherever they need to get to in order to get, if they don't do a driver's license anymore, they've got to do an ID, and they may not have one of those. I saw a story recently about a woman who had voted in every election. She's like 90 something years old, mm-hmm. and all of the steps that she was going through with her granddaughter in order to try to vote. And so can you explain what the issues are there? And we're going to get to, at the end, some action items concerning these different steps.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through a couple of the specific issues, but I want to touch on what you just kind of highlighted and you started off talking about, is when we talk about Black voting rights, right? It impacts everybody's voting rights, right? And so our historic efforts ever since we were here to expand the right to vote has impacted everybody. The Black voting rights struggle has impacted the women's voting rights struggle. It's impacted young people that you just talked about. Even the notion that if you're old enough to serve at 18, that you ought to be old enough to vote, that comes out of Black struggle, right? Disability rights, right? Language rights, people that need to get their ballots in particular. Every group benefits from the historic struggle of Black folks to get voting rights and to make this a closer to the democracy that it has always pretended that it is. And so some of those issues that you just mentioned really touch on that. The attacks that they're leveling against us, attacks on vote by mail, photo ID, closing polling places, it impacts people with disabilities, it impacts young people, it's impacting college students, because they know that college students tend to be slightly more progressive than the general population, especially the older white population. And so I'll take for example, in Florida, where I actually just testified in a case for suing the state of Florida over their voter suppression bill. And one of the things that they're doing is they've made it more difficult, in order for you to even request your vote by mail ballot. Why? Because even though Republicans traditionally in Florida had used vote by mail more than Democrats, in this last election cycle, Black folks and other folks came out and have historic turnout using vote by mail. And so they're trying to attack that entire process. Part of what they're doing is they're saying that you've got to provide this identification, that you've got to provide your social security number or your driver's license number. But guess what? It's got to match what's already
Yeah.
on file, right?
Yeah.
It can't just be, oh, I'm gonna do one or the other. You got to provide that which they already have on file. Now, some people may not even remember what they put down when they did their voter registration. But guess what? Like you said, you got some older voters been voting for 40, 50 years who never even submitted that info. So guess what they now need to do? They're gonna have to resubmit. They've been voting for 40, 50 years, but if they try to request that ballot and they don't have the matching number on file, they won't get that ballot.
It's not even didn't ever submit. It's, see, people want to act like slavery was so far ago. They want to act like we're not in the vestiges of it. These people do not have original birth certificates.
That's right.
And cannot get them.
That's right.
So you're talking about people on whose backs we have a country who are being prevented from voting because they cannot access records that they were not permitted to have. Because when they were born, like an X was marked in a paper ledger that reflected colored girl.
That's right. That's right. It's like so,
and they're still living.
That's right.
I'm so hyped, but okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this is not ancient history that we're talking about, right? This isn't even just history book stuff. This is stuff that our parents, our grandparents have had to deal with, and that we're still dealing with today. And so this is very real time. And that's just one example of the voter ID stuff. We've got attacks on drop boxes. They're trying to limit drop boxes. In the state of Texas, you had a whole attack. They created a whole, in your home state, they created a whole bill targeting what the elected officials in Houston and Harris County were doing, which were common sense approaches that led to historic turnout, because they were doing things like, in the midst of COVID, doing 24-hour voting and voting by car and drive up and all that stuff, and it worked.
But Cliff, do you remember when it was like 2 days before we got there in 2020 that Governor Abbott had changed it for Harris County in the middle of a pandemic and changed it to where the Reliance Center was the one drop box for absentee ballots for all of Harris County. And for people who are on here who don't know how large Houston is in Harris County, who don't know how large that is, it is larger than the state of Vermont. And there was one drop box and cars lined around and around and around, and people on foot trying to be 6-10 feet apart in the middle of a pandemic. And what I hear now, which is why I'm interrupting to raise it, is that they changed it recently where you got to do paper ballots. You have to submit paper ballots for, and you know, they won't let you do an online ballot. They won't let you, so you got to do the paper ballots. Then because of the supply issue,
no paper.
Out of paper.
That's right, no paper. And that's what they do. They
make
create,
it make sense.
They create the only way to make it make sense is if we put in the context of the historic voter suppression and white supremacy. They create these mechanisms that are designed to fail, and then they penalize us for when it fails, and they act like, oh, like we didn't have nothing to do. It's just like when they create, by passing these bills, they create the long lines, but then they make it harder for us as organizers to serve people that are on long lines. So you create the very problem that when we then try to come and address, you criminalize us for trying to address it, right? And so they create, and it's the same thing with the ballot. It's the same thing with photo ID in Alabama. When they first did their photo ID law, they did it, and then they said, oh yeah, you got to go get your ID, but guess what? We're also going to close all of the DMV, all of the motor vehicle departments in the Black Belt of Alabama where Black folks are. So they literally tried to close down all the places you could go to get your photo ID after they required the photo ID. So they create these mechanisms knowing what the impact is going to be. They are target, and that's why we call it Jim Crow 2.0, right? People say, oh, it's not Jim Crow. There's no black only sign. It's not the same thing. But in regards to voting, and you just pointed this out, all those things you talked about, counting the jelly beans and all that, on paper, that wasn't restricted just to Black folks. On paper, it was across the board, but it's the implementation that made it be Jim Crow 2.0, right? It was targeted at us. the same way that all these provisions, ID, polling place closures, drop boxes, all of that is targeted at Black folks. The whole insurrection was targeted at Black votes. Because what was the insurrection about? It wasn't about overturning the whole election. It was about overturning certain states.
Yeah.
And in overturning those states, what they were really saying is certain cities. And in overturning certain cities, what they were really saying is those Black votes should not be counted. And so that's what the insurrection was all about. So this is what we're up against, and all of these policies and provisions that they're coming up with. Even if it doesn't say race on the face of it, we know the impact. There was just an audit done in the state of Washington, not the hugest voter suppression state, right? But it showed that the ballots in Washington that were being overturned, or the applications that were being rejected, were 4 times as likely to come from Black folks. In Georgia, we just showed in 2021, the most recent election, that because of the new Georgia voter suppression bill, you had a rate of denying Black ballots that if that law had been in effect in 2020, it would have impacted 3 times as many votes as those 11,700 that Trump was trying to get them to find when he lost Georgia. So in other words, if this current bill that's in place now had been in place in 2020, Trump, the orange man, would still be president, right? This is real stuff that we're talking about. So and it's having an impact. It's already had an impact on elections, and it's got the potential, combined with now these new maps and that gerrymandering and the Supreme Court decision, it's going to have a huge impact on the upcoming elections in 22, as well as the next presidential election in 24. That's why we need federal legislation, and why Black voters matter and our partners are saying, I don't care about the vote that just happened. It ain't over. It ain't over until we say it's over. This battle for voting rights is still on.
Can you explain, because this is another measure that's been under attack, and it's something I know that you all, a service that you provide. Tell us what voter comfort is and why it's necessary.
Yeah, and again, this is part of that the Florida bill that I just testified in, talking about, so in many of these states, what they're doing is that they're attacking voter comfort. Sometimes they call it line warming. It's basically providing support and services to folks as they're waiting online to vote. Again, lines that pretty much only exist in our communities, right? Whether it's 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, or guess what? Even if it's an hour line, right? Some people say, oh, that's not bad. But guess what? Even that hour line doesn't exist at the white polling places. So that's disproportionately racial. And so what we say is that when we see these lines, we provide some support to voters, whether that's food, water. We even give out phone batteries so that people can recharge their phones, because how often does it happen? You waiting there on a long line, your phone goes dead. Now you got all these other things you got to worry about. My kids might be trying to call, my job might be trying to call, whatever it is. So sometimes we've seen people's phones go out, and then they feel the need that they got to get off the line. And so these voter comfort or line warming activities, we know from direct experience, has an effect on people being able to stay, and not just even in terms of the comfort and the convenience that it applies to them to make the best out of a bad situation, but to even make the voting experience be more enjoyable, right? To make it, because when we do this voter comfort, it's not just food, water, cell phone batteries. What do we got? We got music going on, right? We got a DJ out there sometimes at our poll. You've seen it, right, Monique? We got fun stuff going on. We got games sometimes, a jumpy house or something, so the kids got something to do, right? So it's about the whole experience. And we've seen it where what it does is where people will even call up while they're on the line. They'll call up their friends, like, yo, you know what they got going on down here? You better get down here and come vote, right? And so it's about the entire experience. But yes, it helps people to stay online, to be able to cast that vote. And again, these are lines that have been they're not natural disasters. These are man-made intentional disasters that only show up in I had to wait for hours. I've got a son who literally had to stand in line for 6 hours in Georgia to vote in 2020. And that's not an isolated incident. So this is real talk that happens in our communities, and line warming and voting comfort is a big way to deal with that. But they have tried to criminalize it in states like Georgia and Florida and some other states.
Right. And here's and I guess one of the things I think about, especially in places like Houston, extreme heat, you know,
Hmm.
or other places that have extreme cold. It
Hmm.
really, if you think about people who can pass out
That's right.
waiting in line,
That's
just
right.
trying to exercise a right, a constitutional right to vote. But you know, for everything that you guys do with voter comfort, I know one thing you don't do. You don't tell people how to vote.
That's
You're
right.
encouraging people. I just want that to be clear, that
Right.
this is not about vote for this party or
Right.
vote for this candidate. This
Hmm.
is vote.
And that's a part of the voter suppression too, because we've had it where we've been harassed while doing voter comfort just because we have on our shirts the same image that you see behind me on those signs. All it says is Black Voters Matter. That is not a partisan message, right? That is not a pro-candidate message, but some people look at it and they say that it's inherently dangerous or it's inherently partisan, just like we saw the other day. I saw a post the other day about a sister that was almost couldn't compete in a swim match because she got on something that says Black
Yep.
Lives Matter, right?
Yep.
So you got people that try to treat it that way and will say you can't. We've had voters trying to wear their shirts and go vote and be told you can't come in and vote because you got that shirt on. Not their candidate on the shirt just says Black Voters Matter, but they're told that they can't go vote. And so that's part of the intimidation that happens a lot of times when you have these anti-line warming, anti-voter comfort laws. It creates more of a framework which lets poll workers and law enforcement then intimidate and try to harass our workers, our partners, or even voters, even though we've had situations where we've given the poll workers food and water because they
Mm-hmm.
can't get up and do it
Yep.
themselves, right? So it's not
Yep.
about partisan, it's about providing support for this entire process, which, by the way, even if some of these polling places wanted to provide these services themselves, guess what? Because part of the voter suppression that we've seen in these bills is that they also try to get rid of what they call third-party money, right?
Mm-hmm.
When people give donations to authorities so that they can better implement their elections, whether that's by doing food or water or being able to hire more workers or being able to have masks and be COVID safe, right? They've made that illegal. So not only are they not providing the services themselves, they don't want somebody else to pay for it, and then they don't want an outside group to do any of this. Again, all of these things are designed to impact our vote because what they know is they don't have to suppress every vote, but if they do enough of these things, it's like we always say, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. If they get rid of the drop boxes, if they move a polling place, if they get rid of the food and water, if they do enough of this, then that can impact elections, which in many cases are extremely close elections. And that's
Yeah.
what they have figured out. They don't have to take over every board of election. Right now in Georgia, they're trying to take over the Fulton County Board of Election. All you need is one county
Yeah.
to say that you're going to get rid of some of these votes, and you've just now changed the results of an election. So we are in very, very serious times, and we've got to have a different kind of conversation, even beyond passing these voting rights acts, definitely beyond just mobilizing voters, because we can't out organize this voter suppression. But
No.
we've got to have a conversation even about what does democracy even mean? What does majority rule even look like in
Yeah.
a true democracy? These are kind of the conversations that Lonnie Guinier tried to have and should have had a hearing to have 30 years ago, where we could have
Yes.
talked about what structural changes do we need to make to notions of majority rule and to representation. We've got to get beyond just talking about voting rights and talk about the structures of this democracy and reimagine and reshape all that. That's the only way that we're going to be able to get the power that we really need and deserve.
Well, and that leads us to our last area. And guys, I forgot to remind you, but if you, because I see some questions going by, if you have a question, use the question icon, because I'm here listening to my guest just with all my eyes and ears and attention on him. So stick it in the question icon, and I'll try to get to it at the end. And I have pinned a tweet with a way that you can support Black Voters Matter, and you see that that's their IG handle that's in the pinned tweet. So please follow them there. Support any way that you can. But Cliff, what we gonna do? Because
Yeah.
I hear you that
Hmm.
we do need to be having these bigger conversations, and there
Hmm.
certainly is a lane for that, where advocacy that is big A advocacy
Hmm.
is important, where we are trying to reconfigure, and maybe not reconfigure, but get that back to the original configuration of what it meant to have a democracy, and how and what is necessary in order to course correct in order to get back, at least on paper, to what that looks like and put those guardrails in place. But if you could tell us, because I believe that there are local measures that any single person who's on here can do, and then there are things that need to be done on the state level, and then there are things that you all are fighting for in your organization and others on the federal level. Just give us what those things are.
All right, so let me start off with big picture in terms of the advocacy. You mentioned our pinned tweet is there. You can follow us at Black Voters MTR. Text us, text voting rights to 25225. That spells black. So the number to dial spells black is 25225, and the message is voting rights, and that'll get you connected so that you can see, so that you can take a pledge and see how you can get involved. We have action steps that people can take. We're actually going to be doing a major campaign, 1 million voters for voting rights. 1 million for voting rights that we're going to be announcing on February 21st. That's John Lewis's birthday. May he rest in power. And also, we're going to be doing some big stuff when we go to Selma this year. And I hope you'll be there too, Monique. When we go to Selma for the annual Bridge Crossing Jubilee, the commemoration of Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March, we'll actually be leading one of the days of that march reenactment on Wednesday the 9th. That's after the bridge crossing on Sunday. As we start going towards Montgomery, we'll be in Lowndes County on that Wednesday doing some activities, historic Lowndes County. And so lots of ways for people to get plugged in terms of the battle for voting rights. At the local level, and some of that is at the local level because it involves doing local actions, at your state capitals or at your federal representative, your congresspeople's office or whatever, but also even more locally, because some of these battles are about what's going on with these county board of elections, what's going on with your local board of elections. We say election protection isn't something that only happens on election day. We've got to be engaged all throughout the year. Like right now in Lincoln County, Georgia, where we're fighting, they're trying to close 6 out of 7 polling places. These are battles that take place all throughout the year around what these boards of elections are doing. How are they
But
trying
wait,
to?
Cliff, let me interrupt you right there. I want people to pay attention to that story because I think I was on Roland's show and talking about that a couple of weeks ago. You just said they're trying to close 6 out of 7 polling places, and it's only been the activists and the local citizens on the ground that stopped the vote the last time. But guys, what this would mean is this is in a rural area. They don't have public transportation. And the only polling place would be for some people 20 to 30 minutes away. Go ahead, Cliff, sorry.
That's right. Yeah, 20 to 30 minutes away, transportation issues, even issues in terms of sometimes not everybody's comfortable going to the courthouse to vote. Right. Some of these courthouses remain hostile environments. Right. And so yes, all kinds of issues on why, closing all those polling places would be incredibly problematic and have an impact on turnout. And so, but those are the types of battles that folks can be engaged with, even locally, by staying in touch with, who's making those decisions, who's serving on those boards, how are they replacing people on those boards? Those boards, they decide things like the number of polling places, the locations of those polling places, right? The hours in some cases. And so being involved in those discussions is important. Being involved in what's going on the ballot up and down the ticket, because I'm going to tell you one place where Republicans, conservatives are incredibly active right now is on these local school boards. That's where a lot of these battles around so-called critical race theory, which to be clear, is not being taught in any public school, right? Especially not K through 12 or even college. But that's where a lot of those battles are playing out. So we got to be involved in our school board, and not even just because of critical race theory, because of issues around COVID, just because of issues of other issues of curriculum and representation and things of that nature. So for all these reasons, we got to be involved, even at the level of local school board elections. So there's a lot of work to be done in order for us to really protect our voting rights, in order to protect and guarantee that we're getting progress on the issues that we care about. And again, that includes police violence and accountability. It includes housing and justification issues. It includes gentrification. It includes environmental justice issues. One of the things we'll be talking about in Lowndes County during that Selma to Montgomery March is the issues there of environmental justice and sewerage and things of that nature. Clean water, right? We know something about that, whether you talk about Flint or Pittsburgh or South Carolina. All of our communities are dealing with these issues, but this is the way that we engage people in the electoral process. When we talk about protecting voting rights, for some people, that's enough in and of itself because voting is sacred. For some people, the next question, if they say, well, why do I need to be involved? What's the big deal about voting rights? And that's when we got to be able to break it down. And as Roland always says, connect the dots between the voting rights and your job and your kid's school and the quality of your house and your rent and all of that stuff. We got to be able to connect those dots. All of that has to take place at the local level and from the ground up. That's how we change cities. That's how we change counties. That's how we change states. And that in turn is how we're going to change this country.
And what about on the federal level? What are you looking to see happen?
Yeah, so a couple of things. We're still fighting for the federal legislation. We think that, it was important that the president finally, belatedly came out and demanded changes to the filibuster, but he did it. And that battle has got to continue. We can't, now that they had that vote, they can't just say, okay, that didn't work and move on. And so we're still pushing. Again, that's why we're doing the 1 Million for Voting Rights campaign. We're still pushing for that federal legislation. Don't get it twisted. This thing that they're talking about, this Electoral Count Act, that is not a replacement for voting rights. In fact, that act could make the problem worse. So if you're watching the news or reading stories and you're seeing things talking about, oh yeah, they're going to pass the Electoral Count Act in order to protect democracy, that ain't the solution. That ain't it, right? We got to have the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That's more actual voting rights, and that's what we're going to be fighting for at the federal level. At the same time, we got to deal with this court. So that's why we and others have made a demand that the president, not only that he holds his promise that he appoints a Black woman to the Supreme Court, but it's got to be a system that's got a history of dealing with these issues, right? Somebody that can go toe-to-toe with somebody like Chief Justice John Roberts, who's basically been salivating and having dreams about ending the Voting Rights Act literally for decades. Somebody who's got a history who can go toe-to-toe with somebody like him and the other conservatives on the court. It can't just be the traditional. This is not the time to just do a traditional pick for the Supreme Court. If we believe that we are in a historic moment with an historic attack on civil rights and voting rights and labor rights and women's rights, if we believe that this is a historic moment where, as the president said, these are some of the worst attacks we've seen since the Civil War, a moment like this requires that you've got somebody who is battle tested and not just the traditional. I don't have anything against somebody being a judge, but that can't be a prerequisite for who can best speak to our needs in this moment, right? And so that's why we've been saying, somebody like a Sherrilyn Ifill or Judith Dianis or somebody like that. We need somebody that's really a warrior for voting rights. At the same time that we made that appointment, we've also, Monique, we got to have a serious conversation about expanding the court, because this court is nothing but a partisan court right now. What they did
they stole the seats.
They stole seats, right? They stole seats. They decided an election in the year 2000 with Bush and Gore. This court is basically trying to decide the outcome of these midterm elections. That's why they put aside the stay in the Alabama case and said, no, we're not going to wait until some future election. We need to get this done right now on these 22 elections, because they're trying to weigh in on the balance of power in Congress now. It is a partisan court, and we can't just keep on acting like, it's an untouchable court. The number of justices on the court has been changed dozens of times in history. It can be done again, but we've got to have a serious conversation and not run away from having that conversation under some notion of, both sidism and tradition and all that stuff. We are in an untraditional moment. We've got to have some untraditional strategies. So yes, voting rights legislation, the Supreme Court pick, expanding the court, building local power, all of that we're going to be fighting for. We're going to be back and forth to DC because we're going to be doing some more protests outside the court, outside the Senate.
Y'all don't never call me.
You got an open invite. You got an open. Come on, get on the bus.
You come to my hometown. I can't be hospitable. Nothing. You come here. You go protest. You get arrested, and then you leave.
And then we out. That's right. That's right. Well, next time we come up, as soon as I get out of jail, I'm gonna call you up.
Thank you. I got bail money. I'll be ready.
Let's do it. Let's go.
Well, I wanted to add one that former Secretary Hillary Clinton posted the day after the legislation went down and tanked this last time, because we know that Sinema and Manchin acted like the two monkeys that could stop a show. And a way to prevent that is to support senators being elected that can make their two votes against the changes to the filibuster irrelevant.
That's right.
So y'all know now Brother Albright and them and their 501c3s and C4s may not tell you direct, like I'm gonna tell you to go look at Val Demings and support. Go look at Charlie.
Oh no, we'll tell them. We got a pack too.
I forgot you got a pack too. So, for me, those are things you also guys can do, even if it's not Senate seats in your state. Your money can go there. Your voice can go there, because by the next election, we could be in a different position. Even if we can't get anything to happen before the midterms, we could still win some seats in the midterms that will make things much easier. But any closing words? I don't see any questions pinned. So any closing words, Cliff, before I let you go?
Just to piggyback on that, you mentioned Val Demings in Florida. Of course, we got to hold on to a couple of seats. We got an important Arizona election. We got, of course, a big one here in Georgia, where Senator Warnock has been a big champion for voting rights in the Senate. We got some seats in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, that we're also going to be doing some work around. North Carolina, we got a sister running in North Carolina, right? And so, a bunch of critical. Wisconsin, we got to get rid of this fool Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. We got to get rid of him. And so there's several critical Senate seats. I'm glad you mentioned that, Monique. There's several critical Senate seats that we need to be fighting for. And I'm going to throw this out there too, because y'all and Monique talking about, us coming to D.C., don't sleep on D.C., because guess what? If D.C. was a state the way that it ought to be, we'd have two senators from D.C. and we wouldn't have to be chasing around Manchin and Sinema. So y'all, there's a H.R. 51, which is the D.C. statehood bill. If you don't know about it, find out about it. But we got to get these senators to get behind D.C. statehood as well. Not just because we need those Senate seats, but because the denial of the right to vote to 700,000 citizens is in and of itself voter suppression, and it's one of the oldest forms of voter suppression in a state that will become the first
representation.
Exactly. And we could have the first plurality Black state right there in DC.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Cliff Albright, and by extension, Latasha Brown. And thank you to Black Voters Matter Fund, and thank you for all those who support Black Voters Matter Fund and all the work that they do. Thank you for giving us this time. I'm going to be calling you again and again and again. But I so appreciate you explaining these things in detail for us, because if there's anything more than anything else we need for it to make sense, we need for our vote and the fight for the protection of our vote to make sense. So thank you so much, Cliff. I appreciate you.
Thank you. And thank you for helping to make it make sense. Thank you, Monique.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Can't stop, won't stop.
Can't stop, won't stop. So guys, I hope that you enjoyed today and today's interview with Cliff Albright, who's the executive director and co-founder for Black Voters Matter Fund. Look them up, look up their organization, the work that they're doing across the United States. Support if you can, any way that you can. And then also, as he said, do your part. And, we will be right back here tomorrow at noon with another session of Make It Make Sense. We're live every day at noon. If you'd like to support, if this is helpful to you and you'd like to support the work that we're doing, please go to my bio, to the link tree in my bio, and there's several different ways that you can support the work of our brand new fledgling daily show. I'm excited about what we're doing. I hope that you're finding it helpful. And if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have issues that you need for them to make some sense, you want us to try to make it make sense, send it in the DMs. Drop a comment under these posts as we post for the shows. Put your questions down in the question icon, and we will do our best to get you answers, to get you some facts, some data, and the truth. All right? Thank you so much. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.